The Krusty Krab should have been shut down a long time ago. And I know what you're thinking. It's just a cartoon restaurant. It's just a plot device. Relax, bro. And you're right, technically. But hear me out. If you actually stack everything that has happened inside that building across every season, including every health violation, every labor crime, every moment where someone almost died and Krabs just shrugs it off, it kind of stops being funny. Or, well, it's still funny, but it's also kind of insane that nobody has done anything about it. Because here's the thing about the Krusty Krab. It's so much more than just a bad restaurant. Bad restaurants get reviewed, reported, boycotted, and eventually replaced by something maybe slightly less terrible. Meanwhile, the Krusty Krab is still open to this day. And by the end of this video, you're gonna understand exactly why that is. First and foremost, the Krabby Patty, Bikini Bottom's most beloved menu item, the heart of the Krusty Krab's entire operation, the thing that has kept this restaurant relevant for decades despite everything we're about to go through. Because here's what I think most people miss about the Krabby Patty. Everyone talks about how good it is, as if it's the best culinary option in Bikini Bottom and there's nothing else like it. But nobody talks about why people keep coming back. If we're being completely honest with ourselves, everyone describes the Krabby Patty more like a substance rather than a lunch. And I don't mean that loosely. I mean, we've seen it time and time again where a single Krabby Patty is capable of triggering a compulsive dependency that completely overrides all basic judgment. Now, Squidward spent years refusing to even try one. And then, one bite, and the man is sneaking into the Krusty Krab at midnight to consume so many in one sitting that his hips just explode. Now, I want you to think about what that story actually sounds like if you remove the cartoon logic from it. A man with zero prior interest in a product tries it once, loses all self-control in the same day, and ends up alone at 4 in the morning, consuming it in secret until his hips physically gave out. That is a cautionary tale. And if that's not enough, let's talk about what happens when you don't have one. What we're watching is a full withdrawal response. Stomach cramps, psychological distress, the complete inability to function as a normal member of society, all because he hasn't had a Krabby Patty in long enough. And the Krusty Krab is serving it with a side of fries. What's crazy is that this is before we even get into what's actually in the food, which, and I cannot stress this enough, has at various points included ingredients that have absolutely no business being anywhere near food. At one point, in an attempt to outdo Plankton with his own grease food, Krabs loaded the food with so much grease that customers became physically incapable of functioning. A health inspector had to get involved, but we'll come back to how that went. Because as it turns out, the whole answer to this problem isn't that simple. You can't just call a health inspector to give Krabs a warning. Krabs wouldn't take that sitting down. Especially if you're a Krusty Krab's employee. Because if you thought being a customer at the Krusty Krab was a gamble, being an employee is like taking that gamble on a loan. On paper, working at the Krusty Krab is a pretty simple job. You show up, you do your job, you go home. SpongeBob flips patties, Squidward takes orders, Mr. Krabs counts his money. Everybody knows their role. But what the Krusty Krab actually is, underneath all of that, is a workplace where the concept of employee rights has never once been seriously mentioned. And I don't mean, oh, the boss is a bit tough there. I mean, there is a document, an actual invoice, that Squidward received itemizing charges for breathing, standing, talking, and existing on the premises. Now, I want you to sit with that for a second. That is an employer billing his own employee for the biological functions required to stay alive. In any functional labor system, that document alone would be enough to shut the whole operation down. But it just gets filed under just how things are at the Krusty Krab because it is what it is. Raises? Union representation? Don't make them laugh. Basic labor protections? There's a reason Squidward has been threatening to quit for 20 years and somehow never quite manages it. Because leaving would mean admitting there's nowhere better to go, and staying means accepting that this is just the deal. At one point, purely to outcompete Chum Bucket, Krabs announced that the Krusty Krab would be open 24 hours a day because he said so. There's no single thought there about how his employee might have to go home and live their own life outside of work. With that being said, their best fry cook was once fired over a nickel, which tells you everything you need to know about how the Krusty Krab values the person who has kept its kitchen running for decades. But here's the part that really gets me, because all of that is just Krabs being cheap. Annoying, yes, but it's just him being him. What Patty Caper shows us is something far worse. SpongeBob spends the entire episode playing detective, tracing every lead, genuinely trying to solve the crisis, only to find out that Krabs stole it himself to avoid paying $1.99. And his first instinct when cornered, point at SpongeBob. When the whole restaurant is at risk, Krabs finds the nearest employee and makes sure that if someone is going down for this, it isn't him. At this point, employees at the Krusty Krab are expendable. Sure, they're useful, right up until the moment they become inconvenient, and then they're the first ones thrown under the bus. Which actually brings us to something pretty interesting. Because for all the ways that Krabs has mistreated the people working for him, there was one moment where he figured out something even more efficient. Why exploit your employees as workers when you can exploit them as a brand? A food critic gives the Krusty Krab a glowing review, specifically praising SpongeBob, which, of course, Krabs doesn't reward him enough for. He doesn't give him a raise or even a thank you, but he does turn SpongeBob's entire identity into some kind of an attraction. There's SpongeBob's face on everything. His name is on the menu, everything in the restaurant is now yellow. However, SpongeBob, being SpongeBob, is genuinely excited about it, which makes it worse. By the time we get to the spongy patties that are made from old, rotten meat rebranded to fit the theme and that start making customers sick, Krabs ends up in court facing what should be a serious consequence. We'll get to that in a moment. So we've established that working at the Krusty Krab is, at best, a psychological endurance test. But here's the thing. At least employees chose to be there. At least they walked in knowing that this is part of their day and Eugene Krabs was going to be involved in their day in some capacity. But customers, they didn't sign up for any of that. They just wanted lunch. And yet somehow, being a customer at the Krusty Krab is arguably worse. For one, the moment you walk through that door, everything you have is a potential revenue stream. I know it might sound confusing, but let me explain. There's a money-back guarantee at the Krusty Krab. It's printed right there on the menu. Guaranteed satisfaction or your money back. But you can't read it normally. It's printed in a font size that requires a magnifying glass to even get noticed by regular fish. Props to Bubble Bass to know it's there in the first place. The man is really going deep with his research just to get those free patties. Still, it's there, technically, so legally he's good. Fries are extra, napkins are extra, refills are extra. And if you drop your Krabby Patty, that's on you. The rulebook says so. And yes, there is a rulebook. There was an incident where customers attempting to leave the Krusty Krab were physically prevented from doing so until they had spent every last cent in their possession. Yeah, they just got stopped at the door and told to go back and spend everything they had. At another point, he was charging customers per step inside the restaurant. Per step, which means the further your table is from the door, the more you've already spent before you've even sat down. I genuinely don't know what the legal term for that is, but there's gotta be one. Sometimes it's about cutting costs so aggressively that the customer experience becomes actively dangerous. During one winter, Krabs set the thermostat inside the Krusty Krab so low, customers were sitting inside what was essentially a refrigerator, in their coats, eating cold food, because Krabs did the math and decided their comfort was an unnecessary expense. There was also the time he discovered that Gary's shell had somehow developed the ability to magnetically attract loose change, and the first thing that came to his mind was to walk Gary around town like a living ATM skimmer, hoovering coins out of people's pockets without their knowledge. He also took him to a casino after that. Yeah, I'll just leave that there. But I think the one that irritates me the most is Krabbyland. Because, at least with the adults, you could argue they should know better. They've been to the Krusty Krab before, they know the fine print is unreadable, they know what they're walking into. the kids don't. Krabs looked at a group of children on summer break and did the math on how much money their parents had. So he built a playground out of what can only be described as a junkyard, and then watched SpongeBob, who was genuinely, sincerely trying to make these kids happy, get physically beaten for their entertainment while he counted the coins. He used SpongeBob's goodwill as the actual product, which, and this is where it gets interesting, also explains why the Krusty Krab is still open. Because every time it should have been closed, every time something happened that by any reasonable standard should have ended this whole operation permanently, there was always someone who cared too much to let it burn. Everything we've talked about so far, the food, the workplace, the customers, all of that is Krabs just being cheap and cutting corners wherever he can. It's bad, but it's also, in a weird way, just kind of predictable. You know what you're getting with Krabs in these situations. What puts the Krusty Krab in a completely different category is what happens when someone from the outside tries to do something about it. Because the moment any kind of external accountability enters the picture, Krabs just makes it disappear by whatever means necessary. Let's start relatively small. Plankton slips on a wet floor inside the Krusty Krab and sues. Now, a wet floor is a legitimate liability. Slip and fall cases are real. This is exactly the kind of reason that health and safety regulations exist. A responsible business owner will acknowledge the hazard, settle appropriately, and maybe put down a mat next time. Krabs spends the entire episode trying to wriggle out of it. Every angle, every loophole, every possible way to avoid taking any responsibility whatsoever for something that happened inside his own establishment. And this is definitely not because he couldn't afford to settle. It's just because the principle of admitting fault is genuinely incompatible with how he operates. The Krusty Krab has never been wrong, at least by his account. Then there's the time the Krusty Krab was actually, formally, legally shut down. Closed by order. Done. You could argue that the old lady was being a pooper because she just hates the fun part of Krusty Krab. Still, Krab's response to a legitimate government closure was to immediately move the entire operation underground illegally into SpongeBob's house. Rather than contest the closure through any kind of proper channel, rather than appeal, rather than engage with the process at all, he just relocated and kept going like nothing happened. Because in Krab's mind, the law is not something you respect or work within, it's just an obstacle for him. And obstacles usually have workarounds. But both of those, the lawsuit and the closure, are almost reasonable compared to what happened with the health inspector. So, a health inspector arrives at the Krusty Krab for a routine annual check, standard procedure, the kind of visit every food establishment receives. And Krabs, having half heard a news report about someone impersonating health inspectors to get free food, convinces himself that this man is a fraud. Now, a normal person in this situation might call the police, file a report, and then let the authorities handle the rest. But not with Krabs. He asks SpongeBob to make the single most lethal burger in the history of the restaurant. Volcano sauce, seahorse radish, toilet water, and an old gym sock. Fortunately, the inspector chokes on a fly, hits his head, and loses consciousness. Yes, I did say fortunately, because at least he doesn't end up eating that cursed patty. Getting concussed is like a walk in the park compared to that. And then, a second news report confirms the real impersonator was already caught elsewhere, meaning the man on the floor is the genuine, legitimate health inspector. What follows is, and I want to be precise here, an attempted cover-up of what Krabs believes is a murder. Multiple attempts to keep the inspector unconscious anytime he shows signs of coming around. SpongeBob, to his credit, is horrified throughout all of this. He is visibly, vocally uncomfortable with every single decision being made. But Krabs was almost unfazed for the whole ride. And at the end of it, after all of that, the Krusty Krab passes its health inspection. Of course it does. Because that's the thing about the Krusty Krab. It doesn't matter what happens inside those walls, the place just keeps going. And for a long time, I thought that was just the thing with this show. there's no continuity, nobody learns anything, roll credits. But I don't think that's actually what's happening. Because there's one detail that runs through almost every single one of these incidents. One variable that keeps showing up every time the Krusty Krab should have faced real consequences and somehow didn't. And it's not crabs. It's SpongeBob. It's always been SpongeBob. Think about it. Really, think about it. The health inspector incident? Who was there, panicking, inadvertently keeping the whole thing from unraveling completely? SpongeBob. The greasy buffoon's health violation? Who called the inspector, and then who cleaned it all up before it went too far? SpongeBob. The underground Krusty Krab, every single moment where the walls were genuinely closing in on this place, SpongeBob was there, and Krusty Krab survived. Because surprisingly, the most exploited person in that building, the guy who gets fired over a nickel, who gets framed for ingredient theft, who gets charged for breathing adjacent to his workplace, genuinely, sincerely, with his whole heart, loves that restaurant. He's not blind to it either. We've seen him get pushed to his limit. We've seen him crash out, walk out, break down. He knows on some level what's happening. And he keeps showing up anyway. Which is, and I mean this in the most affectionate way possible, a little bit heartbreaking when you think about it. Because SpongeBob is just that naive. He's just someone who decided that the thing he loves is worth protecting, even when the person running it doesn't deserve that protection. Even when every reasonable instinct says, let it burn. Sound familiar? Because here's what I keep coming back to. The Krusty Krab shouldn't exist. By any logical, legal, or moral standard, it should have been shut down years ago. The food is a controlled substance, the workplace is a labor violation waiting to be filed, the customers are prey, and the moment anyone gets close to doing something about it, Krabs either buries the evidence or moves the whole operation underground. And yet, every town has a Krusty Krab. Not literally, but you know what I mean. That one place that has absolutely no right to still be open. That one business that has survived every scandal, every complaint, every health inspection, every lawsuit, simply because it figured out the one thing that makes accountability nearly impossible. It made itself necessary. The Krabby Patty is addictive. The town is hooked, and somewhere in that building is always a SpongeBob, someone who cares more than enough to keep it running. That's just how it works. But the most unsettling part is, you already knew all of this. You've watched it happen season after season and laugh every single time it happened. We all did, because it was funny, and because it was familiar. That's the thing about places like the Krusty Krab. Everybody noticed, since day one even, but they decided it was easier to just order the burger. Although, and this may be a separate conversation, if you actually start counting how many people in Bikini Bottom didn't make it out of various situations completely intact, the Krusty Krab is honestly just the beginning. Because SpongeBob as a show has a surprisingly complicated relationship with the concept of characters just not being around anymore. Which is exactly what we get into next time, how many characters were killed off in SpongeBob. I'll see you on the next dive.